Hello and welcome back. Sorry about not getting you a video last week. I spent all weekend contemplating my great moral failing in that regard. Anyway, while I was doing that, I realized that I had never actually reviewed a Blur album on this channel. Which is weird, because I'm a huge Damon Albarn fan. So, yeah, I thought I would rectify that. So, that's what we're doing. Blur were one of the biggest bands of the 90s in the UK. They had many hits. They went toe-to-toe with Oasis in the Battle of the Britpop in 1995, and actually won the singles battle, but ultimately lost the overall conflict when their 95 album The Great Escape was outsold pretty decisively by Oasis's smash hit, What's the Story, Morning Glory. They were pretty much the face of Britpop for a couple years, and it's hard not to understand why. I mean, they helped to invent the genre with albums like Modern Life is Rubbish and Park Life. But the album I'm going to talk about today is the beginning of the transition away from that sound. Blur's 1997 album, Blur. This is an interesting record because it's, like I said, the beginning of the transition away from Britpop. Also the beginning of the transition for Damon Albarn away from the sort of stereotypically English as envisioned by Americans who have never been to England, or in my case went to England once when they were very, very young, and only saw the rural north of the country and not the thriving multicultural, multi-ethnic metropolises that are the cities of the South and such like. Or at least I'm led to believe. I've never seen them. And into the next phase of his career, the sort of as I said, multicultural, looking towards America, you know, sort of, as I am legally obligated to say as an American Damon Albarn fan, the sort of transition into the sound that would characterize a lot of the more rock stuff on the early Gorillaz albums. But of course, Blur wasn't just Damon Albarn, and the guitarist Graham Coxon was also a major driver on the sound of this album. And more specifically, he had been listening to a lot of kind of indie stuff, you know, like Pavement, that kind of bands, you know, 90s cool kid music, you know. If you were hip, you had to prove that you weren't one of those knuckle-dragging, beer-swilling meatheads listening to Pearl Jam. You put on some Pavement, you know, wowie zowie, just... All joking aside, Pavement were actually a really good band. Listen to their stuff if you haven't. Which is definitely an influence on here, although I don't hear it as much as some people say. I hear a lot of solo Syd Barrett, and I hear a lot of sort of the earlier, less Britpop, sort of vaguely shoegazy stuff Blur did before Modern Life is Rubbish, and to a lesser extent before even Leisure. So you know, that's there. It also, as I am legally obligated to say as an American, has one of Blur's 2 American hits. In fact, it contains the only one that anybody actually remembers, because Crazy Beat was apparently a hit over here, but I never heard it until I bought Think Tank, so yeah. So that was the intro, very long, very rambly, very incoherent, but yeah.
Here they are, kids, Blur.
So we open up the album with one of the most memorable tracks on here. It's sort of Britpop-y, but also sort of not at the same time. I've heard that this is supposed to be about heroin, because this was during Albarn's relatively brief period of heroin use, but I honestly don't know. Whatever the case, it's a great track and one of my favorites on here. So the second track on the album is the big one, the one that broke him in America. The only thing I think the average American probably knows about Blur other than, wasn't that guy who does Gorillaz? You know, and what can I say? It's a fun track. There are conflicting stories about how it was written. The general agreement seems to be that it was a joke of some kind. I've heard it was making fun of grunge. I'm not sure I believe that, mostly because it doesn't sound anything like grunge at all. Or that it was their idea of something that would be too extreme to release, which I have to say, that's a pretty conservative idea of what's too extreme to release, guys, but you know. Country Sad Ballad Man is another fantastic track. Weird, aimless, low-key, slightly stoned. A lot of cool guitars on this track, and I loved the vibe, you know, it's very just kind of doing your own thing off by yourself kind of deal. You know, I hear the Pavement a little bit, but But mostly it's just Blur, you know, and that's kind of what I was getting at in the intro with that little joke there. It all just kind of sounds like Blur. This is another great track. Fantastic vocals, performances, melodies, choruses, chord changes, etc. It's a fun, sort of upbeat driving track. And that's not terribly surprising because they borrowed liberally from David Bowie's 1979 track, Boys Keep Swinging. Which is itself a rewrite of another track on Lodger, the opening Fantastic Voyage. I think they might have gotten sued over that, but I'm not actually sure. Whatever the case, great track. This track is great as well. I love the almost psychedelic quality, the almost looped characteristic of elements of the track, and the fun guitar noises. It all blends together to form one of my favorites on the album. Probably like number 1 or number 2, it's hard to say. And yeah, I put this off long enough, but the backing vocals in part of this song is where you really kind of start to hear the debut of the sort of vocal mannerisms that Albarn uses for a lot of Gorillaz. And I promise I will stop talking about this. I'm doing a whole review of Gorillaz' first album later this week. I'll keep the comparisons on the down low until then. But you know, like I said in the intro, I said American Blur fan, legally mandated to talk about that at least once, and I just had to get it out of my system. I'm biting my tongue on this. I really am. You know, this is a fun, weird, experimental kind of track. It's got some cool organ, some of the only like really prominent organ on the album, because this is for the most part a very guitar-centric record. And it's a cool atmospheric piece. Not much more to say than that. You're So Great is my other favorite track on here. It's a Graham Coxon, more or less solo track, I believe, and it's the first Blur song he ever took lead vocals on, which I honestly wish he would have done more. He has a very different style to Albarn. He's a little shakier. You can tell he's not as confident in his singing abilities, but I think that really works, and I like I said, I wish he would have done more, because this and the other big track he does, Coffee and TV, on the next Blur album, are some of my favorite songs they did. As far as the music goes, it's a wonderful ballad, very lo-fi, great guitar thing going on, you know, same pleasantries I've said about every track on the album so far. This is another phenomenal track, more great organ, more weird lyrics. This is where the album starts to get really weird and really drugged up. You know, there's a lot of stuff like that in the back half of this album, and as somebody who enjoys music that sounds like that, it's fantastic stuff. Chinese Bombs is kind of just a fun, like, novelty punk song thrown in the middle of the album. It's good, but it's very, very short, and I don't have a whole lot to say about it. This is another really weird, drugged up, out there track. Great guitar noise, that sort of thing. A little bit lo-fi, but not, you know, they're going for that indie sound, but there's a certain level of professionalism and, you know, in my opinion at least, a certain quality and probably amount of money being thrown at the recordings that doesn't quite square up with the stuff they're writing, which gives it this very interesting vibe. Most of what I said about The Death of a Party could apply here too, but I don't think the vocal melodies are quite as catchy. It's more just weird stuff to appreciate. Look Inside America is a really interesting track for a couple of different reasons. Musically, it's the one thing on the album that could probably have fit in on The Great Escape, although lyrically I don't think it would have quite suited that album. It's more first person. You could make a debate about whether the second verse switches perspectives to a different character, but the first verse is definitely Damon, and it's very sort of inside baseball on the emptiness of life as a pop star in 90s Britain. But there's also the subject matter, which is kind of an indifferent take on America, and it's compare and contrast with a track on Parklife, Magic America, which is a very sort of sneering kind of look at, you know, Damon and the boys looking down their noses at some stupid Brit who wants to go to Magic America. Whereas this track feels like more of a statement of, you know, it's not for him, but it's okay. Maybe that's somebody else's cup of tea. You know, maybe that's somebody else's thing. It's an interesting track. You know, some of it's that I heard this album and Parklife at the same time, but you know, I think I would have made that comparison either way. This track is another favorite of mine too. Probably the last song on the album I absolutely love. It's very psychedelic, very out there, a lot of great sort of guitar stuff, as I've been saying on every track on here. The vocal melody reminds me a lot of the sort of post-Britpop stuff that Travis and Coldplay were doing, but way better. Great psychedelic guitar. I think there's a slight David Bowie influence, what with the whole line about They Say It's No Game, and you know, the whole general vibe being kind of like Space Oddity, but it's hard to say how tangible of a thing that actually is. Moving On is the last actual song on the album, and it's a track where I always forget how much I like it until I turn it back on. It almost feels like something that would have been on The Great Escape, you know, maybe not so much the production, it's too raw to fit on there, but definitely like the melodies, the synthiness. It feels like a deep cut that just kind of escaped from that album and didn't get found until this record. So we end the album with this track, a very long thing, sludgy, out there, structureless, just jam. Apparently they did a lot of jamming during the recording of this album, and a lot of the songs were refined out of jams, but you really don't hear that. On the whole, this is an album of very tight and focused songs, albeit with a little bit of space in between them for weirdness, but this is the only time the album just goes all out and just sort of does its thing. And it's not a bad jam, but it's nothing that you desperately need to hear. It adds 11 minutes to an album that's already kind of long, and I would be lying to you if I said I listen to this regularly. In fact, I usually turn the album off after moving on. But when the mood takes me, it's a pretty good track. There's also a hidden track in there somewhere. I think it's interlude, and maybe there's another hidden track in there too. I don't know, but yeah. Blur is a fantastic album. Blur is a fantastic album. For a long time, I think I would have told you this was like my third or fourth favorite by them, but I honestly, going back to it, I think it might be number one or number two. For a long time I said that The Great Escape was my favorite Blur album, but nowadays I think I gravitate a little bit more towards this, because this has everything I like that Blur did. It has the catchy pop rock singles, it has the weird stuff, it has the kind of shoegazy, Syd Barrett-y, psychedelic whatever. You know, it has all of that. And it's all there in one package, and you know, it's the quintessential Blur album to me. You know, I might send somebody to Parklife first, but you know, I might send somebody to this. It depends on what their approach to Blur is, because you know, if they're just somebody who likes good songs, I would send them to Parklife or The Great Escape. But if there's somebody who has a little bit of a pretentious side to them, a little bit of skepticism towards Britpop and the whole 90s thing, you know, I would send them to this album, because this album has enough weirdness that they wouldn't just be, oh, this is a bunch of posh, pretty boys from Essex doing commercial rock for the 90s. This is why Disco Inferno couldn't get famous. Get that shit out of here. Give me some Stereolab, you know, give me some Bark Psychosis, give me some Radiohead, you know, get OK Computer in here, you know. This album is less likely to make somebody say that, and so in a sense, it's the Blur album I would send somebody to first. It's got a lot of my favorite songs by them on it, you know. I mentioned On Your Own, Country Sad Ballad Man, you know. You're So Great, especially. You're So Great is like a top 3 Blur song for me. And it's just a solid listen that is hard to go wrong with. You know, it is a little long. That's the one substantial critique I can make of this, and of basically all the classic Blur albums. Every album Blur put out during their original run is at least 2 or 3 songs longer than it needs to be. With the exception of Think Tank, which is not actually really that long, all things considered, you know. My friend Eric, who I brainstorm a lot of ideas that make it into these videos with, said once that he thought if Blur's albums had been 10 or 15 minutes shorter, they would be like the greatest band of the 90s. I don't fully agree with either of those takes, but it's one I'm more sympathetic to here, because I don't really know that Essex Dogs adds that much to the album. You could probably take it off and not lose that much, but you know, if you're, as I said, if your favorite song is Essex Dogs, I'm not gonna judge you. It's a fun little jam, and it shows you that Blur had some instrumental prowess. You know, they could actually produce something sonically satisfying when they just jammed out like that. Yeah. Very, very good album. Very, very solid. Recommend it very highly. It's the one I go back to the most these days. Not necessarily my favorite, like I said, although it is close, but it's the one I go back to the most. And I feel like that's as good of a note as any to end the video on. I will be back hopefully on Thursday or Friday with my review of the first Gorillaz album. So until then, I will see you all later.